The war in Ukraine leading the agenda at an EU summit, leaders gathering in Brussels for day two. Amid a shortage of manpower and ammunition, the EU is considering using proceeds from frozen Russian assets to help finance Kyiv's fight against Moscow. Knock on effects of the war also being addressed today. Armen Georgian, our Europe editor, is standing by in Brussels. We can speak to him now. Hello to you, Armen. One of the big concerns for Ukraine is that it might have its special access to EU markets restricted. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, just before I come on to that, Will, on the question of frozen assets that you mentioned, just two very quick points. It's important to point out that we're talking about profits on frozen assets, not the assets themselves. So that's actually a much smaller figure, estimated at 3 billion euros, much smaller than what the assets themselves are worth. Also, the final summit conclusions on that point are very guarded, and they make it clear that there is no agreement on exactly what this money will be spent. Some EU members wanted it to be spent on weapons for Ukraine. That is not going to happen. Hungary and Slovakia, which don't want to have more military aid to Ukraine, would not be on board with that decision. So this is still very much work in progress. Now, on the question of trade access for Ukraine, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, yes, Ukraine's tariff-free access to the EU market has been extended for an extra year, but with some important caveats, because there are certain products that will have caps applied to them, and this is, of course, all an effort by the EU member states to do something in response to these protests by farmers across the EU who've been saying that they're being undercut by this unfair Ukrainian competition. So the agriculture discussion is going on, I believe, around this lunchtime in Brussels. We should have some final conclusions on that, and obviously I'll get back to you with more.
Yeah, Armen, earlier this morning, some economic and financial matters took center stage. What more can you tell us?
Yes, so the economic discussion really stemmed from the fact that banking stocks were down because of the events around Deutsche Bank. And so this was a point where EU leaders and also the head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, tried to reassure everybody to say that the banking sector in the Eurozone is resilient, and several EU leaders echoed that message from Christine Lagarde. They also mentioned the various reforms in the banking sector that have been brought into play since that financial crisis of 2008, which has cast such a long shadow over the last 15 years that it's still being talked about to this day. But of course, some of the innovations that were mooted in the wake of that crisis all those years ago have not come to pass. Things like the Capital Markets Union. The Belgian Prime Minister, Alexander De Croo, was again calling for that kind of integration of the banking system. But again, some member states are jittery about that kind of convergence of national rules.